The hospital corridors were buzzing with the usual rhythm of urgency. Stretchers wheeled past, monitors beeped in distant rooms, and the faint scent of antiseptic hung in the air. But for Mark Carpenter, none of it was background noise anymore. It was his reality. Mark was 52 years old, an active man who had always believed in staying healthy. But one morning in January 2010, he noticed something unsettling. Eating felt strange, as though food got stuck halfway down. At first, he brushed it off, maybe stress, maybe indigestion. But within weeks, even water felt difficult to swallow. His wife, Emily, watched him grow quieter with each meal. He didn't complain much. Mark wasn't the type. But the shadow in his eyes told her everything. They went to his general practitioner, expecting a prescription or diet change. Instead, the doctor looked at Mark with a heavy sigh and spoke words that seemed to slow time. It's esophageal cancer. In that moment, Mark's life cracked. The word cancer hung between them like an impossible weight. Emily felt her breath hitch. Mark's mind flashed with his children's faces. The doctor explained the tumor was advanced. His local surgeon reviewed the scans and shook his head. Surgery was too risky, survival uncertain. But giving up was never an option for Mark. Together with Emily, he searched for another path. That search led them to a name whispered like a rumor in medical circles, Dr. Kim. Chief of thoracic surgery at the nation's most prestigious hospital, Dr. Kim was a genius with lightning-fast hands, impossible instincts, and a stubborn refusal to surrender a patient to fate. Colleagues called him the miracle doctor. Patients called him their last hope. When Mark and Emily first met Dr. Kim, his sharp eyes studied the scans, then shifted to Mark with quiet conviction. "You're a candidate for surgery," he said simply. It wasn't a promise. It was a challenge, to both of them. From that day forward, the hospital became Mark's second home. He would endure a year of surgery, chemotherapy, fear, and fragile hope. But he wasn't alone. Dr. Kim and his team were relentless. They fought for Mark's life with skill and compassion that went beyond medicine. This is the story of how a man went from a surgical table to training for an Ironman, and how a doctor risked everything to pull him back from the brink. Because sometimes, survival isn't the end of the story, it's the start of a new one. If you believe in hope, in miracles, and in the courage to fight, stay with us until the very end. But before Mark could face the Ironman starting line, he had to survive the fight for his life. That battle began the moment Dr. Kim took his case, against the odds, against the clock, and against a disease that had already claimed too much ground. The winter sky was gray the morning Mark got the second opinion that would change everything. He sat in the waiting room of a small community hospital, his hands clasped tightly together, trying to appear calm. Emily sat beside him, flipping through a magazine without seeing a single page. The surgeon entered with a polite but guarded smile. He reviewed the scans, spoke in technical terms, then finally lowered his voice. "Given the stage of your tumor, I'm afraid surgery isn't advisable. The risks outweigh the benefits." The words cut deep. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. Emily swallowed hard, her nails digging into her palm. The surgeon's voice became a distant echo. No surgery meant no real chance. That night, Emily sat at their kitchen table, laptop open, determination replacing her fear. She read everything she could find about advanced esophageal cancer. In a quiet corner of an online forum, she found the name Dr. Kim, a surgeon who was said to take on the impossible cases. Some called him reckless, others called him a savior. Emily didn't care what anyone called him, as long as he would see Mark. 2 weeks later, they were walking into the thoracic oncology program's main hospital. The air there felt different, focused, intense, almost electric. When Dr. Kim entered the consultation room, his presence filled it instantly. He was lean, his white coat perfectly pressed, eyes sharp but warm. He studied Mark's scans silently for several minutes, his brow furrowed in thought. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Finally, he looked up. "You're not an easy case," he said, "but you're not a lost one either." Mark felt a spark ignite inside him. "I'll do whatever it takes," he replied. Dr. Kim nodded once. "Then so will I." From that moment, the fight began. The plan was aggressive. Preoperative chemotherapy to shrink the tumor, followed by a high-risk esophagectomy. Dr. Kim explained every detail, but what Mark remembered most was his calm certainty, as though the surgery was not just possible, but inevitable. The weeks leading up to treatment were brutal. The chemotherapy made Mark nauseated, weak, and exhausted, Yet he pushed himself to walk every day, telling himself he was training for survival. Emily became his anchor, managing medications, preparing healthy meals he could tolerate, holding him when the nights grew too long. In the quiet hours, Mark often thought about the man who had agreed to operate when others refused. He didn't know yet that Dr. Kim's reputation came not just from his skill, but from the way he carried his patients' battles as if they were his own. By the time chemotherapy ended, Mark was a shadow of his former self, but the scans showed progress. The tumor had shrunk, just enough to make surgery possible. The date was set. What came next would test not just Dr. Kim's skill, but every ounce of strength Mark had left. The morning of surgery began before sunrise. The hospital lights glowed against the dark sky as Mark was wheeled into the preoperative area. Emily kissed his forehead, her hands trembling, whispering, "I'll be here when you wake up." Dr. Kim entered in scrubs, his surgical cap pulled low. He met Mark's eyes and spoke with quiet resolve. "Today we take it out, and we take back your life." The operating room was a world of controlled chaos. Nurses checked instruments, anesthesiologists adjusted machines, and surgical assistants prepared the sterile field. In the center, Dr. Kim stood like a conductor before an orchestra, his gloved hands poised to lead. The esophagectomy was one of the most complex operations in thoracic surgery, removing the diseased esophagus, reconstructing the pathway for food, and ensuring no cancer remained. The risks were staggering: bleeding, infection, complications from anesthesia. But for Dr. Kim, risk was simply part of the territory. As anesthesia took hold, Mark drifted into unconsciousness. In that moment, the fight shifted entirely to the medical team. Dr. Kim's hands moved with speed and precision. Every cut, every suture was deliberate. He spoke little, his eyes never leaving the field. His assistants knew his rhythm, when to anticipate an instrument, when to adjust suction, when to hold their breath. Hours passed. A section of the tumor proved more invasive than imaging had shown. For a moment, the room grew tense. Dr. Kim's brow tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Suction. Retractor. Let's open this field more." He adjusted his approach, maneuvering around critical vessels with the ease of someone who had danced this line between life and death many times before. Finally, the tumor came free. Dr. Kim inspected the margins with a microscope, ensuring every trace of cancer was gone. Then came the reconstruction, using part of Mark's stomach to create a new esophageal passage. It was delicate work, a puzzle of anatomy and function. Hours later, the final sutures were placed. "Close him up," Dr. Kim said softly, almost like a prayer. Outside, Emily sat in the waiting area, every tick of the clock stretching into eternity. When Dr. Kim finally approached, his eyes were tired but calm. "We got it all," he said. "It will be a long recovery, but the worst is over." Emily exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. For the first time in months, hope felt real. Surgery was only the beginning. Mark now faced the long climb back. Weeks in the hospital, months of rehabilitation, and the constant fear of recurrence. Yet every step forward was a victory, and Dr. Kim's visits to his bedside became moments of steady light in the slow dawn of recovery. Mark's first memory after surgery was the sound of a monitor beeping softly beside him. His throat burned, his chest felt heavy, and his body was weak as if it belonged to someone else. Tubes and wires tethered him to the bed, but when his eyes opened, Emily was there, holding his hand. "You made it," she whispered, tears welling up. Recovery after an esophagectomy was never simple. The first days were a careful balance of pain control, infection prevention, and gradual mobilization. Dr. Kim stopped by every morning at sunrise, his rounds precise and unhurried. He never rushed the conversation, even on the busiest days. "How's the pain today?" he'd ask, studying not just the chart but Mark's face. Mark would manage a small smile. "Better, I think. Or maybe I'm just getting used to it." Dr. Kim's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Don't get used to it. We'll keep working until it's gone." Walking again was the first milestone. On day 4, 2 nurses helped Mark sit up, his legs trembling under his own weight. The hallway seemed impossibly long, but he shuffled forward, each step echoing in his chest. Emily walked beside him, counting the steps quietly, her pride shining through her worry. Food was another challenge. For weeks, Mark could only take in small amounts of liquid nutrition. Dr. Kim explained that his reconstructed esophagus needed time to heal. Patience, he said, was as important as determination. Some nights were darker than others. The pain would spike, nausea would return, and fear would creep in. Mark wondered if life would ever feel normal again. In those moments, he remembered Dr. Kim's words before surgery. "We take it out, and we take back your life." By the third week, Mark was walking laps around the ward. The staff noticed. Nurses would cheer him on, other patients would nod in encouragement. There was a sense of quiet camaraderie in the thoracic unit. Everyone there understood the fight. When the day finally came to go home, Dr. Kim met them at the discharge station. "You've done the hard part," he said. "Now comes the harder part, living." Emily drove slowly, avoiding bumps in the road. Mark looked out the window, seeing the world in a way he hadn't in months. The trees seemed greener, the air sharper. Survival gave everything a new texture. That night, lying in his own bed, he realized recovery wasn't about getting back to who he was. It was about becoming someone new. Leaving the hospital was a victory, but it also meant stepping into uncertainty. At home, there were no monitors, no nurses at the press of a button, only the slow, solitary work of rebuilding a life. And yet, each day brought small signs that Mark was moving toward something bigger than survival. The first month at home was a delicate dance between progress and setbacks. Some mornings, Mark felt strong enough to walk the block. Others, he could barely get out of bed. Meals were still tiny, carefully measured to avoid overwhelming his healing digestive system. Emily became both nurse and coach, preparing nutrient-packed smoothies, tracking medications, and insisting on short walks even when Mark protested. She had her own fears, but she hid them well, knowing Mark needed strength to borrow from her. Follow-up visits with Dr. Kim were like checkpoints on a long journey. He reviewed scans, checked incision sites, and asked about symptoms with an intensity that made Mark feel both reassured and scrutinized. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult week, Mark admitted his fear. "What if it comes back?" he asked quietly. Dr. Kim didn't dismiss the question. He folded his arms, leaning against the desk. "Then we fight again. But until that day you live. Not just survive, live." The words stuck with him. He began taking his walks more seriously, adding a few extra steps each day. He started keeping a journal, not just of symptoms but of small victories, walked half a mile, finished a meal without nausea, laughed without coughing. Months passed. Slowly, his stamina returned. The first time he walked a full mile without stopping, Emily clapped like he'd finished a marathon. And in a way, he had. At his 6-month follow-up, the scans showed no evidence of disease. Dr. Kim gave a rare smile. "You're clear. Keep it that way." On the drive home, Emily asked what he wanted to do with his second chance. Mark stared out the window for a long moment before answering. "Something big. Something I couldn't have done before." That night, he searched online for endurance challenges. The idea came quietly but firmly, the Ironman triathlon. It was absurd. He could barely jog to the mailbox. But the thought wouldn't leave. He didn't just want to live. He wanted to test the limits of the life Dr. Kim had saved. With the shadow of cancer receding, a new challenge emerged, one of muscle, willpower, and grit. Mark had faced the operating table and survived. Now he wanted to face the open road, the long swim, the endless ride. Training for the Ironman would be a different kind of battle, but one worth every ounce of effort. The decision made no sense on paper. Less than a year earlier, Mark had been learning how to swallow again. Now he was mapping out a plan to swim 2.4 miles, bike 112 miles, and run a full marathon back-to-back. His first training session was humbling. A slow walk around the block left him winded. His legs felt heavy, his chest tight. But the memory of the hospital, of Dr. Kim's steady gaze, pushed him forward. Emily was skeptical at first. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked. "No," Mark admitted with a grin. But surviving cancer wasn't safe either. He started small, light strength training, gentle yoga, short swims. Each week, he added a little more. The first time he managed a 10-minute jog, he called Emily from the park just to say, "I did it." Dr. Kim was cautious but supportive. "Listen to your body," he advised during a follow-up. "You've rebuilt once. Don't break yourself again." Mark joined a local triathlon club, where seasoned athletes taught him about pacing, nutrition, and mental endurance. Many were surprised when he told them his story. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others said he inspired them. The training wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Every mile on the bike, every lap in the pool, was a reminder that he was alive. On hard days, he pictured the operating room, the tumor being lifted from his body, the steady hands that had made this possible. By the time race season approached, Mark's body had transformed. He wasn't just a cancer survivor. He was an athlete in training. Emily saw it too, the spark in his eyes, the confidence in his stride. The night before his first Ironman event, he sat quietly on the porch, listening to the crickets. Tomorrow, he thought, I get to prove to myself that I'm more than what happened to me. The sun rose over the racecourse, painting the water gold. Hundreds of athletes stood at the shoreline, wetsuits glistening, hearts pounding. For Mark, this wasn't just a competition. It was the final chapter in a story that had begun in a hospital bed. Somewhere, he imagined, Dr. Kim was watching, ready to see what came next. The starting horn blasted, and Mark plunged into the cold water. The first strokes were chaotic, arms and legs everywhere, the churn of bodies fighting for position. But he found his rhythm, each breath steady, each kick strong. The swim was exhausting, but the bike leg was where the real battle began. Hills tested his legs, wind tested his patience. He fueled himself carefully, remembering Dr. Kim's warnings about respecting his limits. Halfway through the run, fatigue hit like a wall. His chest ached, his stomach turned. He slowed to a walk, every step heavy. Doubt crept in. Then he heard a voice in his head, steady, certain. Until that day you live. Mark straightened his back, started jogging again. The crowd's cheers grew louder. Emily was at the finish line, her hands over her mouth, tears streaming. When he crossed, the announcer's voice boomed. Mark Carpenter, Ironman finisher. The medal was heavy around his neck, but lighter than the weight he had carried years before. The race ended, but the journey didn't. Mark had proved his strength to himself, but there was something more he needed to do, something that reached back to the hospital halls and operating rooms where this second chance had begun. It was time to give back to the place, and the man who saved him. Mark returned to the hospital not as a patient, but as a volunteer speaker. He visited new thoracic surgery patients, sharing his story, showing them photos from the Ironman finish line. Dr. Kim listened quietly from the back of the room during one talk. When it ended, he approached, smiling faintly. "You've done well," he said. Mark shook his head. "We've done well." He agreed to let the hospital use his case for ongoing research. His tumor sample joined hundreds in the Thoracic Oncology Laboratory's tissue bank, helping researchers identify genetic patterns and potential treatments. It was his way of ensuring that future patients might face better odds than he had. In the quiet of the lab, surrounded by microscopes and frozen samples, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. His survival wasn't just his own, it was part of a larger fight. Today, Mark remains cancer-free. Emily still walks with him every morning. Dr. Kim continues to take on the impossible cases, his legend growing quietly in the world of medicine. Mark's message to anyone facing the unthinkable is simple. If you're still breathing, you're still in the fight. Don't quit before the miracle. The lesson is clear. Survival isn't just about beating the disease. It's about what you do with the time you're given after. So if you've read this far, take a moment. Think about the thing you've been too afraid to try, too tired to chase. Then take the first step. The road might be long, but it's worth every mile. Because sometimes, the finish line isn't where the story ends. It's where it finally begins.